Colleagues, I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 23 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February 12th, 2026, the committee is meeting on the humanitarian situation in Cuba. La réunion d'aujourd'hui se déroule en format.
Today's meeting will be in a hybrid format according to regulation. The members will be in the room and remotely via the Zoom application.
Consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, especially and including the interpreters. You will also notice a QR code on the card which links to a short awareness video. I would also like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon and to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. For those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can make the selection for the appropriate channel for interpretation, floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. I would now like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour of this meeting. From the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, Mark Richardson, Director General, Central America and Caribbean Bureau. Sébastien Beaulieu, Director General, International Emergency and Travel Advice Bureau. Carolyn Noble, Executive Director, Central America, Cuba and Dominican Republic Integrated Division. And Tara Carney, Director, International Humanitarian Assistance Division. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks. I now invite Mr. Richardson to make an opening statement.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs et les membres du comité. Comme le Président a dit, je m'appelle Mark Richardson et je suis...
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mark Richardson. Today I'm with my colleagues, Karen Noble, Sébastien Beaulieu and Tara Carney from Global Affairs Canada. Global Affairs Canada has been monitoring the situation in Cuba very closely, with a particular focus on two priorities. First, the safety of Canadians who live on the island and the impact of the ongoing crisis on the Cuban population, particularly among the most vulnerable. Just as a reminder, on February the 5th, the President of Cuba declared a national state of emergency, and in the days that ensued, the Cuban government announced a series of emergency measures to prioritize essential services. Shortly afterwards, following a notice from Cuban authorities telling people that jet fuel would no longer be available at the country's international airports until at least March the 11th, all Canadian airlines announced on February the 9th their decision to suspend services into Cuba. Since then, over 28,000 Canadians have already returned home. This process has run smoothly and with no major consular concerns. All Canadians who wished to return home were able to do so through the flights offered by Canadian Airlines.
The energy crisis has led to widespread power outages, with rolling blackouts disrupting essential services and further constraining economic activity. We remain deeply concerned by worsening conditions on the island and by the toll these pressures are taking on Cubans across the country, particularly those in vulnerable situations. For more than 5 decades, Canada has been delivering international cooperation in Cuba. Last fiscal year, Canada provided $8.3 million in development assistance, positioning Canada among Cuba's leading Western donors. Canada also has a history of providing life-saving humanitarian assistance to Cuba following acute crises. As recently as October 2025, Canada provided more than $3 million in immediate humanitarian assistance following Hurricane Melissa. Currently, humanitarian partners are developing plans to scale up assistance in response to the current crisis, and we are in active and regular contact with them to determine how we can best assist Cuba's most vulnerable. As Minister LeBlanc stated last week and Minister Anand confirmed yesterday and today, I understand, the federal government is ready to support humanitarian assistance efforts in Cuba, and we are preparing a plan to do so. The current crisis is in part due to Cuba's heavy dependence on imported fuel. In recent years, Cuba has faced persistent challenges in securing reliable oil and fuel supplies due to long-standing trade and economic restrictions. As we know, these pressures intensified following recent measures by the United States, including the January 29th executive order, which threatens to impose tariffs on countries which provide oil to Cuba. The U.S. government has publicly stated that it is seeking to reach an agreement with the government of Cuba that would lead to profound and far-reaching reforms, including expanding the privatization of the Cuban economy and driving meaningful political change. While Cuba's current economic crisis is the result of a combination of factors, including long-standing internal inefficiencies stemming from Cuba's rigid, centralized economic model, the U.S. embargo continues to have a significant impact on Cuba's economy. Switching to French. Le Canada entretient des relations diplomatiques.
Canada holds diplomatic relations with Cuba on a continual basis since 1981. We remain in open dialogue with the Cuban government. During our discussions, we regularly share our concerns about the lack of political freedom and the detention of political prisoners. During this difficult period, marked by uncertainties, Canada resolutely remains in a situation of constructive discussion with Cuba and support for the Cuban population, particularly among the most vulnerable people. Thank you very much. We will be very happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much for your speech.
Beginning with MP Rood, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here today on this important topic. Through you, Chair, I'm wondering, given the severe humanitarian suffering in Cuba, why is Canada not ensuring humanitarian aid is delivered directly to the people, bypassing the government entirely and publicly calling for an end to the totalitarian system that created this crisis in the first place?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the committee member for the question. Canada has a long-standing practice in Cuba and in other countries of working through international humanitarian partners in order to deliver our assistance, and that is that continues to be our practice in Cuba at this time.
I'm wondering if you can tell us how much Canadian taxpayer money has been spent since 2020 on embassy operations, consular services, and international assistance in Cuba, and does the department believe that it is responsible to continue spending Canadian tax dollars propping up diplomatic infrastructure in a country whose government is actively allied with adversaries currently targeting Canadian interests?
Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. I don't have the exact figures on how much our operations cost for the embassy on a year-to-year basis. However, I can say that roughly over the last 7 years, we have provided on average $6.5 million in development assistance to the Cuban people through our international humanitarian partner agencies. In terms of the question as to why we would maintain a diplomatic presence, I think traditionally we have maintained a diplomatic presence in Cuba due to our long-standing relationship with the country, where we have been committed to having an open dialogue with them with a view to promoting cooperation, collaboration, trade and investment ties, people-to-people ties, as well as being able to have frank and honest conversations on areas where we don't see eye to eye, such as human rights practices and international alignment with other state actors such as Nicaragua, previously Venezuela, Russia, and China.
So, given that Cuba remains a one-party dictatorship that jails dissidents, restricts basic freedoms, and partners with regimes that are hostile to Canada, such as you mentioned, Russia, China, and Iran, why is the Government of Canada still providing any taxpayer-funded assistance or maintaining full diplomatic relations rather than downgrading ties and directing all support exclusively to the Cuban people through independent civil society and faith-based organizations?
Mr. Chair, and thank you to the member for the question. I think, as I've stated previously, we continue to support the Cuban people through a variety of humanitarian assistance organizations, particularly UN agencies and other international NGOs, including Canadian NGOs that have a presence there, and we will continue to do so. That is to support. We continue to support the Cuban people. In terms of why we would maintain a presence, I think part of the reason we maintain a presence is the active people-to-people ties. Cuba is one of the countries where in the Caribbean region and in Central America that has the most visitors or most tourists on an annual basis. Last year, our figures are that approximately 700,000 Canadian tourists visited the island. The year before that, I believe it was 800,000. And so it's necessary for us to maintain an active diplomatic presence there. Also, I would note that Canada has an active commercial relationship with Cuba to the total of about $1 billion of trade on an annual basis, and Canadian companies do have investments in the country. Hence, we continue to maintain a diplomatic presence in order to assist Canadians both on the private side as tourists and in terms of their business interests.
Rather than continuing the failed policy of quiet diplomacy that has, quite frankly, achieved nothing for the Cuban people in decades, has the department considered or recommended any future assistance or trade preferences be made on concrete, verifiable steps towards free and fair multi-party elections and immediate release of all political prisoners?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. We have certainly raised time and again with our Cuban counterparts our concerns related to human rights concerns in terms of particularly political prisoners and their treatment. We also have raised concerns with regards to democratic governance and transparency of institutions. And I can say that we raise these regularly with our Cuban counterparts.
Well, the Cuban government receives support from Russia, including alleged recruitment of Cubans for its war in Ukraine, China through Belt and Road style arrangements, and Iran. How does continued Canadian engagement with Havana not undermine Canada's own national security and sanctions policies against these same hostile actors?
Chair, thank you. Again, I would go back to our conversations in terms of the desire to have an open and frank dialogue with the Cuban government, seeking to build constructive ties between our countries, and being able to influence their democratic governance to the best of our abilities. We have found a number of areas where we do, in fact, are aligned in terms of human rights policies, in terms of gender equity initiatives, as well as gender equity initiatives, as well as LGBTQI plus rights and the treatment of people.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we go to
Mr.
MP.
Chair, can I
Yes.
just ask that they table the figures from the 2020 spending operation since 2020 on the embassy? As I know you weren't able to provide that, but if you could table that with the committee, I'd appreciate that for my second question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We go next to MP Stephen Guilbeault. You have 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Merci à tous nos...
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our guests who are with us. Maybe you could explain to us the purpose behind international humanitarian aid. Is this purpose to support populations in difficulty in different countries in the world, or is the purpose of humanitarian aid to see the changes in political regimes in different countries?
L'objectif de nos...
Chair, the objective or the purpose of our humanitarian aid in Cuba in the current time is to support the Cuban population, mainly. We concentrate on the areas of renewable energies, nutrition, food safety,
Responsabilisation des...
accountability, and independence of business women, and also various other areas. In one of your answers to one of the questions, you said there were 700,000 to 800,000 visitors from Canada who go as tourists to Cuba per year. 5,000 Canadians live in Cuba on a permanent basis. So is Canada used to, with so many Canadians who are either visiting or living there, to not supply consular services when there are so many of our nationals living there? Chair, I will invite my colleague, Sébastien Beaulieu, to ask him to answer this question. Yes, the presence of an embassy or consular services for Canada is very useful in crisis moments and at any moment to support visitors and tourists who visit from abroad, whether we're talking about lost passports or to help them with migration issues, visas, or even more serious issues such as prison sentences, loss, theft, or various health-related incidents, hospital stays, for example. So it's always useful, and we really appreciate to have our presence there to support Canadian nationals. And for Cuba, the figures speak for themselves. They're very high numbers of people. Thank you. We hear a lot about the humanitarian crisis, and I would quite like to hear one of you talk about the situation, about the humanitarian crisis, about food, fuel, medication, and how do we follow the development of this crisis in Cuba from Canada? Chair, we follow the changes in the development of the crisis very closely, especially through conversations with our humanitarian partners on the field, or in the field, and also with various agents who work in the embassy. And I'm going to hand the floor to my colleague, Tara Carney, who will be able to give you more information about this.
Thank you for that. So on the humanitarian crisis, there are certainly a large number of vulnerable populations in Cuba. The humanitarian crisis prior to this point had been really focused on natural disaster response. They don't have a protracted humanitarian crisis, though there is significant vulnerability in the country. So what we are doing right now, as Mr. Richardson said, working very closely with partners who are engaging to try to understand the changing needs as the energy crisis has the potential to impact and bring more people into a humanitarian level of need. What we are seeing is that the first sectors that are likely to be impacted should there continue to be a lack of fuel will be sectors such as health, which rely heavily on fuel, water and sanitation, which requires energy, particularly for the water pumping, as well as the food insecurity sector, simply because of food availability, food prices prices as well as transit of foodstuffs. So those are the areas that we are watching closely with our partners and via our partners at this time. Thank you.
Est-ce qu'il me reste du temps, Monsieur le Président?
Do I still have time left, Chair?
Le gouvernement du Canada
Very quickly, what choices is the government of Canada assessing at the moment in terms of humanitarian aid for the Cuban population?
Monsieur le Président,
Thank you, Chair. We are engaged with stakeholders in the field, with our humanitarian partners, and they are assessing the needs in Cuba as we speak in order to prepare for the next plans and programs and to be in a position to announce and define our plan for humanitarian aid to Cubans in the near future. So I don't have any details on this information for the moment that I can actually share with you at the moment. Thank you. Thank you for your answers.
MP Duceppe, vous avez 6 minutes.
You have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here at the committee meeting. I'm interested. I want to go back to the last answer that you just provided us with. You're still designing what humanitarian aid will be essential with your partners in the field. We know that Mrs. Shannonbaum in Mexico have sent 800 tons of humanitarian aid. How come Mexico had already made an assessment of the needs and in Cuba a few weeks ago, and Canada is still assessing the needs of the Cuban population, whereas other countries have already sent in their humanitarian aid to Cuba? Well, I can't speak in the name of the Mexican government, but I can tell you that we are working with our partners in the field to really assess the current needs and requirements in order to help the current crisis that's happening there in this country. But it doesn't explain why we're late in comparison to Mexico. You can't give us an explanation for this, can you? Well, actually, I can't give you an answer as far as Mexico is concerned. No, what about for Canada? How come we're so behind Mexico in terms of the timeline? They've already analyzed the requirements of the population a few weeks ago. They've already sent out their humanitarian aid. So how come it's a very straightforward question? Well, the reason is that humanitarian partners are still doing their research and coming up with a plan in order to send the current requirements and needs to us for the population. So you don't use the same humanitarian partners as Mexico for the assessments then? I don't know with whom they talk to, but we do work with United Nations agencies, such as the World Food Programme. We partner with them, and we're currently waiting for their plan based on the needs they've identified to resolve the humanitarian crisis and help with it. We've talked a great deal about the fact that at the moment there's a real dearth of fuel. Mrs. Colley talked about it, to get the power plants to run. And they send the electricity that's required by hospitals, for example. Could it be possible for Canada to send oil to the country to get these units to work, or these power plants to work, since we're one of the biggest exporters of oil in the world? Well, as a government, from what I've understood, we do not have the means necessary to send oil to another country in such a way. And what we usually do is that we work with providing financing to help humanitarian organizations to buy the products the population needs, and to ensure that, or that they need to ensure that the humanitarian aid reaches the populations that need it. Do we have an idea of a deterioration of the situation for certain specific vulnerable groups, for example, older persons or children or persons with disabilities? Do you have any information, or do you include this variable information in your in the information you obtain? Well, based on the information I've obtained until now, I haven't heard anything about persons that are in more the most vulnerable situations. But we do know that the persons in the most vulnerable situations in Cuba do have specific needs. And maybe I can hand the floor to my colleague, Mrs. Carney, to talk about this. Thank you.
Where you see a deterioration like this, those groups that were just mentioned are in fact going to be amongst the most vulnerable always. What we are also looking at in this particular context is those impacted by Hurricane Melissa who had an acute vulnerability to begin with. So populations that we are looking at specifically will likely be from within that group, as well as that listing of who are traditionally the most vulnerable people in any populations: women and girls, disabled, the elderly, those who don't have easy access or mobility.
Est-ce que le Canada participe à des efforts
Does Canada take part in diplomatic ventures with the current regime in Cuba to help with channeling aid, humanitarian aid into the country with the Cuban government? Well, do you have discussions with the Cuban government or with diplomatic organizations or the diplomatic corps through organizations to be able to send this aid into the country? Well, Chair, yes, thank you. We are having conversations with the Cuban government, but not about sending direct funding to buy humanitarian aid. The way in which we work to support Cuban people is through humanitarian partnerships such as the United Nations agencies. We don't do it directly with the Cuban government.
Est-ce que vous sentez une pression venant
Do you feel that there is pressure applied from the neighbors in the south of the country in relation to humanitarian aid? So, for example, regarding the possibility of exporting oil via different organizations into Cuba? Well, thank you, Chair. What I can answer is that the Americans themselves have sent funding and humanitarian aid to Cuba in the months that have passed. I think the figure is approximately $6 million given to the Cuban population via the partnerships and the Catholic Church.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for being here this afternoon. My first question, does the department have any numbers on the percentage of Cuban fuel imports that relied on shadow fleets, Russian, Venezuelan, or otherwise?
Mr. Chair, thank you. That's a very interesting question. In terms of shadow fleets, no, we don't, to the best of my knowledge, have details on the percentage. What we do know is that Cuba is able to roughly supply between 30 and 50% of its own energy needs, electricity needs, through a combination of solar power, which it's in the process of developing, through its own oil and gas resources, and that it made up the bulk of what it was not able to supply. It's not able to supply domestically through imports, principally previously from Venezuela and then from Mexico. And we understand that it has also received fuel exports from a variety of other countries in the past, imports I should say, from a variety of other countries in the past as well.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong. Is it correct that our government recently implemented additional sanctions on the Russian shadow fleet? And is this expected to have any effects in the Caribbean?
Unfortunately, I don't have those details at hand in terms of who we have put sanctions on. That is something that, Chair, with your permission, I would follow up with if that's of interest to the member.
That would be great. Thank you. Has the department done an assessment on the stability of the regime in Havana in the wake of the disruption of Cuba's oil supply?
Mr. Chair, well, an evaluation may be going further than what I would say. We certainly do monitor what is going on in the country and remain engaged to be able to understand what is happening on the ground. Despite the lack of fuel being imported due to the U.S. measures in particular, what I can say is that the Cuban government appears to be quite stable. It has developed itself through all areas of the economy and society in Cuba, and shows no indication of being unstable at this time.
Could you speak to what coordination the Canadian government is taking with the United States in regards to additional sanctions that I spoke to with the Russian or Venezuelan shadow fleets, and what steps are being taken, if any, to mitigate these effects on nations like Cuba?
Mr. Chair, unfortunately, I don't have information on any discussions. I'm not privy to discussions with the United States with regards to our sanctions on Shadow Fleet. What I can say is that we do have regular and ongoing discussions with our U.S. counterparts, including with respect to Cuba and our mutual concerns about the Cuban people and their state and well-being.
So given the shift in the American strategy, has there been any long-term reassessments of Canada's Caribbean strategy?
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, we are all looking at the shift in what has happened in the last number of months and how that impacts our interests in the region. But I can't speculate on any future strategy for the Americas or a change in policy as a result of that at this time.
Okay, thank you. Changing lanes a wee bit, could you please answer why has the Government of Canada refused to impose targeted Magnitsky-style sanctions on senior Cuban officials responsible for human rights abuses, while it has sanctioned officials from other regimes for far less? So I'm curious what message this sends to dictators around the world.
I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's a legitimate question in general, but I think given today's focus on the humanitarian situation and consular affairs for Canadians, I think that question is a little bit out of scope. I was willing to kind of give you more discretion for the earlier questions, but this one kind of goes a little bit out of scope, and I would urge the member to please come back to the focus of the hearing.
Fair. So could we perhaps have some more details on the aid package? There was media reports that aid package is being sent to Cuba. Could you speak more specifically to what could be included in that?
Unfortunately, I can't speak more specifically to what may be included in the aid package. What I can say is that as Ministers LeBlanc and Ministers Anand have stated, we will provide humanitarian assistance. We are ready to provide humanitarian assistance to the Cuban people, and we're waiting, discussing with humanitarian partners on the ground in order to determine what will be included in that package.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we go to MP Van Delbelde. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much to the officials for being here today. I would just like to start with something that you said about Canada right now and perhaps over the last 5 decades being one of Cuba's leading Western donor countries on humanitarian assistance, because there's been some questions here about whether Canada is going to assist. But I mean, if I'm not mistaken, we are currently providing support to the World Food Program, to other agencies and other organizations that are currently on the ground. This isn't something that we would just suddenly have to come up with aid in the current crisis. There's actually ongoing assistance happening right now.
Mr. Chair, thank you to the member for the question. That is indeed the case. As I stated at one point earlier, over the last 7 years, we've provided on average $6.5 million in development assistance to Cuba in a variety of areas. This is concentrated on food security, nutrition, the empowerment of women entrepreneurs, work related to sexual and gender-based violence, equality, or I should say gender equality, as well as renewable energies. We have a number of projects where we have worked, for instance, with Cuban agriculture, folks who work in the agriculture sector, particularly women, in order to help them to increase their yields significantly through education, assistance, and giving equipment, also helping them to strengthen their supply chains. I was, in preparing for this appearance, was really pleased to see the results of a project on the renewable energy side where we've provided solar energy kits to 72 different communities, particularly to households led by women and to a variety of institutions as well, schools, hospitals, where we've provided support to help sustain their electricity needs being off the grid.
Thank you. And I know that I've been getting letters from my constituents, not just on the consular side, but certainly out of concern for the people of Cuba. So it's good to know that we are there. And it is a fairly common practice that we would want to make sure that we're consulting those agencies, whether multilateral or Canadian partners, on the ground to determine what is needed, as opposed to just sending what we think might be needed, right? It's much better to determine that when these crises happen. Is that the process that you're going through right now?
Chair, yes, that is exactly the process that.
Thank you.
I believe that it's best to find out from those agencies on the ground what is, rather than trying to determine what we think is needed.
Thank you. And thank you. And with regard to diplomacy, my understanding, with a few very rare exceptions, Canada often has diplomatic relations with countries where we don't necessarily agree with how they're governed or human rights or other aspects. And actually having those channels of communication can be very helpful. I wonder, in the case of Cuba, if you could tell us if there had been an absence of those kinds of, as you said, hard and frank conversations, an absence of, certainly the economic impact of Canadian trade, but also the tourism. If there was not that diplomatic channel, do you think that there may be worse situations today in terms of human rights and governance in Cuba than there would have otherwise been?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I think that's an excellent question. I think if we look back, I can't speculate on what might have been or could have been, but I think that if we look at the results that we've achieved over the years through our diplomatic engagement with Cuba, I think we can say that we have definitely benefited the Cuban people through the development projects that we've been able to do with the blessing of the Cuban government for the benefit of the Cuban people. We have certainly been able to have open and frank dialogues about increasing transparency within their institutions, their government institutions, and about our human rights concerns, particularly about political prisoners and the treatment of those prisoners. I would say most recently in the wake of the protests in 2021 and our concerns related to the folks that were arrested after that. Not having those diplomatic channels wouldn't allow us to respond to the concerns of the Canadian people about what is happening in Cuba. And our diplomatic engagement with Cuba has very much been based on the premise that it's better to have a conversation, to be able to try and talk through our differences, to recognize where we're not aligned, to say the hard things at times. Quoting a member of your committee who's not here at this time, but we're friends, and being able to, having friendly relations allows us to speak uncomfortable truths at times, and Canada has sought to do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. P. Duceppe, you have 2.5 minutes.
So, does your department have any indications according to which the American embargo has worsened the situation by limiting access to essential goods or fuel?
Monsieur le Président, on peut dire que
Well, Mr. Chair, I think we can say that the measures that the Americans have set in place almost 60 years ago have had an effect on both the Cuban and on the people of Cuba. Yes, but what about on the humanitarian crisis right now? Is this not amplifying things? Yes, it's what we've understood. You said that the Americans had had sent $6 million. So what is the margin of maneuver here to be able to go ahead with the green light in Washington with the actual situation? Well, we will continue to have conversations with the American administration
approche à Cuba
about our approach to Cuba and our fear for the Cuban people.
surtout sur
And we will speak to them especially about the needs of the human people because we want to avoid a humanitarian crisis. Do you have to validate what it is you do with Washington in order to give humanitarian aid? Mr. Chairman, as I said before,
une relation bilatérale avec le Cuba.
we attempt to have a bilateral relation with Cuba that is independent of the US. And we have already given humanitarian assistance in complex situations.
Je pense pas que ça change.
I don't think that this is going to change the situation. But if you have a bilateral relationship with Cuba, in your second answer previously, you said you've had discussions with Washington in order to explain to them why you needed to send humanitarian. Normally, a sovereign country who wants to help another sovereign country and has already a bilateral relationship doesn't have to ask for permission from a third country in order to be able to carry out what it wants to do. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Yes. Mr. Chairman, I didn't say we were having conversations with the American administration in order to ask for permission or approval in order to be able to send humanitarian aid. What I was saying is that we have had continuous ongoing conversations with the American administration on the subject of Cuba, and we've been able to express our concerns as to the humanitarian situation presently and in the past as well.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And I also want to thank the analysts for providing a really excellent briefing for this session, and also our officials who are here. I'm wondering how many Canadians are left in Cuba?
Mr. Chair, that's a good question. What I will defer to my colleague, but what I understand is that we have roughly 6,500 Canadians who are registered with ROCA, Registration of Canadians Abroad. As one of the members of the committee earlier stated, we understand that there's somewhere around 5,000 long-term Canadian residents in Cuba, but the exact number on the ground, I don't have that statistic at hand, but maybe Sébastien, I don't know if you have further to say on that.
I don't have any more information other than to validate those numbers and to indicate that it's difficult to very precisely assess the number of Canadians, but over the past 10 days or 2 weeks, Canadian airlines have helped the return of Canadians who had tickets or who wanted to return to Canada to do so over that period of about 10 days when there were special return operations led by Air Canada, WestJet, and Air Transat.
And thank you for that answer. And I apologize for not knowing this off the top of my head. Do Canadians need a visa to go to Cuba?
Thank you, Chair. My understanding is that no, they do not require a visa.
So, and do we have a full consular? Is there a full consular complement in Cuba right now?
Yes, there is, Mr. Chair. Yes, there is.
So if you're not completely sure how many, just this week we saw some unrest in Mexico that made Canadians who were on the ground vulnerable, and of course there were some technical issues with the registration system. And I'm wondering, under the current circumstances, whether or not you have any concerns that the Canadians who are in Cuba right now, who we can't quite, or who you can't quite locate, whether or not there's a way to locate them if there is an escalation of the crisis.
Mr. Chair, my understanding, based on comments that our minister made yesterday, is that, in fact, our registration system is operating quite well, and that we saw an uptick in the number of registrants. I think in the case of Mexico, although I'm not here to talk about Mexico, of something like 8,000 in one day. So the Government of Canada does not track Canadian citizens abroad actively. And so, in fact, we require on them to register with us so that we can provide them with assistance and information if there is a situation. That is the way that we have typically approached, and we're here. We do maintain a full consular complement in Cuba, and we are able to provide and more than willing and happy to provide assistance to Canadians who are in Cuba at this time and require help.
Given the, Cuba and Mexico are two of Canada's most popular vacation destinations, and given the sort of level of unrest that's occurring in the world, have you given any thought to some kind of registration system, some kind of mandatory registration system for Canadians who are traveling abroad?
Mr. Chair, that's certainly not an area of my expertise and not something that we have talked about or considered. To the best of my knowledge, I will defer to my colleague Sébastien, but my understanding is that we have in the past and we continue at this time to remain and to rely on Canadians to register with us, and that Canadians don't always want us as a government to be tracking where they're traveling abroad, including where they're going on holiday. But Sébastien.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président. J'ai bien compris l'objectif.
Yes, I've understood the reason we're meeting today is to talk about the humanitarian crisis in Cuba, and I think that my colleagues' questions aren't really in that vein. So I'll refer myself to you and defer myself, of course, to you, but I'd like to make sure that questions are about the humanitarian crisis.
This is for Canadians, so it is within the purview.
Thank you for that. And there has been, my understanding is that there was a period of significant consular drawdown in Cuba when some Canadian diplomatic staff were affected by some unexplained health incidents. I'm wondering whether or not in the event of further civil unrest in Cuba, coinciding with a reduction in embassy staffing, whether there are agreements in place to provide emergency consular assistance were the two things to happen at the same time.
Mr. Chair.
Brief response because we're over time.
Okay, thank you. At this point in time, we don't foresee a drawdown due to the situation at hand. Obviously, there are conversations that we are ongoing. Just like every other organization on the ground, our embassy is experiencing firsthand fuel shortages. And so to sustain operations and ensure the well-being of our people in case the situation continues to decline, we are having conversations about our duty of care and planning for that. But at this point in time, we don't foresee an active drawdown, and we plan to continue to maintain our consular people on the ground. And I would say we have Sébastien's excellent team here in Ottawa that also are able to provide assistance to Canadians in need wherever they are in the world.
Thank you very much. To complete the round, we go to MP Fortier.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Et merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chen, and thank you for the whole team for being here today. I know that many questions have been asked. You have repeated yourselves several times, but perhaps he will continue to do so after my question. But I just want to make sure I understand properly. Can you share with us the importance of our diplomatic efforts in order to support Canadians when they find themselves in Cuba? And more specifically, 2 weeks ago, there was about 28,000 Canadians who came back from Cuba. So how important is it to provide consular services, but also all of the diplomatic efforts that are made on behalf of Canada? Mr. Chairman, as I have already said, but I do thank you for the question. Our diplomatic efforts have yielded good results for the Canadian citizens who had received advice on how to leave the island. And we were able to share the information provided by airlines and the various notices for travelers. And we were able also to contact the trade delegations who also are facing rather complex situations in Cuba and who require our field agents and need in order to protect their commercial interests in Cuba with Cuban partners. Thank you for the answer. You have shared the kind of support that is being given to Canadians who have chosen to stay in Cuba. You've given a few examples. If there are any other, I would gladly hear them. Can you also explain to us how you stay in communication with the 5,000 or so Canadians who are registered with ROCA, and which is a service that you are managing? So how do we make sure that we can continue communications with the 5,000 or so people who are remaining in Cuba? And thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I might give the floor to my colleague, Sébastien. Thank you for the question. As to the registered Canadians, we are in communication with them. They know where to find us if they ever need us and if they need proactive consular support. This registration campaign, ROCA, is done via various websites and where people go to. We've got 30 million people go to these websites a day. And so this means that Canadians who are abroad, including Cuba, know how to find us and how to communicate with us if they need to. And I invite anybody in Vanier, Gloucester to register before they travel, obviously, because whether it's in Cuba or Mexico or anyone else, we need to make sure that we can contact people if there was to be a situation, an untoward situation, or at least be able to inform people. And I myself learned recently when I got the mandate with Minister Hernan to take care of the whole consular services. It's just for anybody deciding to travel. I also invite my colleagues, if they decide to travel, to register. Now, let's move on because I've got a couple of minutes left. Is that right, Mr. Chair? Okay, so very quickly. What are the biggest risks that citizens or Canadian missions face in Cuba right now? And what is the engagement strategy consequently? Of course, in just a few seconds. Mr. Chairman, with the permission of the room, I will switch to English if you don't mind. I'll be more specific.
Complex business environment. It has been since the 1960s, the first embargo in place. And our companies have to face financial constraints in particular, in terms of getting access to foreign currency, but also dealing with measures like the Helms-Burton Act and what those implications may be. So it is a very complex business environment. And if I may, just as you have made a call out for citizens to register with the registration of Canadians online and take advantage of our consular advice and being kept informed about what is happening in Cuba and other countries around the world, I'd make a pitch for Canadian companies to take advantage of the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service, for which their taxes are paying and which they can receive excellent advice and connections as a result of the network that we have in Cuba and abroad as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That concludes this part of the meeting. Thank you to the officials for your appearance and testimony before the committee. We will now briefly suspend the meeting to prepare for the second panel of this meeting. Colleagues, I call this meeting to order, and I'd like to welcome our witness from the Embassy of the Republic of Cuba, His Excellency Rodrigo Malmierza Diaz, Ambassador of the Republic of Cuba in Canada. Sir, you have up to 5 minutes to give opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions from members of this committee. So I now invite Mr. Ambassador to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair. The Cuban people is currently going through a very difficult economic situation. The United States government maintains an economic, commercial, and financial blockade that has lasted for more than 6 decades. Recently, President Donald Trump signed Executive Order 14380, which declares Cuba as an unusual and extraordinary threat to the U.S. national security and foreign policy. The U.S. government has declared a so-called emergency in order to impose additional tariffs on third countries that supply oil or petroleum products to Cuba. Although the United States Supreme Court declared the extraordinary tariffs illegal and they must be revoked, the executive order against Cuba remains in effect. Through pressure, coercion, and threats to third parties, they seek to prevent fuel from reaching Cuba. They also intend, without openly saying so, to exercise military control over the traffic of vessels arriving in Cuba. Without energy, every aspect of life in a country is affected. Food distribution, public health, transportation, education depend on fuel, and Cuba only produces 40% of its oil needs. The objective of this oil blockade is clear: to create a humanitarian crisis and try to force a regime change through it. This policy is not new. In 1960, U.S. Undersecretary of State Lester Mallory, whose secret memorandum was declassified, spoke frankly about this. I quote, "The majority of Cubans support Castro. The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment, dissatisfaction, and economic hardship. Every conceivable means must be used promptly to weaken Cuba's economic life." End of the quote. The fact that the United States accuses Cuba of being a threat to its national security is ridiculous. Our government has categorically rejected being a danger to the security of the United States or any other country. The United States authorities are well aware that Cuba systematically cooperates on regional security issues and in the fight against terrorism and drug trafficking. The accusations that Cuba harbors foreign intelligence bases or terrorist groups are false. This entire aggressive escalation against Cuba is based on a campaign of lies. Moreover, we must ask, is the United States acting in accordance with international law and the UN Charter? Does anybody have the right to impose its will by force against another nation? Cuba is not only threatened, but also attacked by a great power, and not just today. It is a long history of aggressions, not only economic. It is worth remembering the Bay of Pigs invasion, the terrorist attacks, including the bombing of a Cubana de Aviación plane, killing over 200 passengers in mid-flight, and the numerous assassination attempts against Fidel Castro. We have informed Canadian authorities about the difficult circumstances the Cuban people is facing. Our countries maintain a strong and multifaceted relationship of over 80 years, characterized by respectful political dialogue, fluid trade, Canadian capital investments, and exchanges in all areas, including a strong people-to-people relationship. The energy blockade not only affects the daily lives of nearly 10 million Cubans. For example, the lack of jet fuel prevents us from providing refuel service to international airlines. As a result, Canadian airlines suspended their flights to Cuba, and thousands of tourists have been affected. The collective punishment of a whole nation is an unjustifiable crime. One may disagree with the country's political project, but there is no right whatsoever that justifies a great power based on its economic and military might interfering in its internal affairs, violating its independence. Much less acceptable is a superpower attempting to achieve its objectives by suffocating an entire people. President Trump says that Cuba must negotiate. Cuba's traditional position has been one of willingness to engage in dialogue and maintain a normal relationship with the United States. We have nothing against the American people. We are open to discuss any topic, even with this aggressive administration, but as equals, without pressure or threats, with full respect of our independence. The Cuban people will resist. We have a history of patriotic defense of our right to self-determination. Moreover, we believe that our cause is just and deserves the support of the international community of countries like Canada, which have the defense of international law among the pillars of their foreign policy. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your opening remarks. I will now open the floor to questions, beginning with MP Rood. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for appearing here today, Ambassador. It's great to have you here. Ambassador, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and independent Cuban dissidents report hundreds of political prisoners, systemic arbitrary arrest, torture, and the complete absence of free speech or independent media. Could you tell us how many political prisoners does your government currently hold, and when will every one of them be released?
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Point of order. Like we were saying a little while ago, the idea today is to talk about consular services and the humanitarian crisis. But are we really here outside of the scope here of humanitarian crisis and consular services?
The focus again, just as I stated earlier, is to focus on the humanitarian situation on the ground in Cuba and consular services for Canadians. I would strongly urge members to try as much as they can to stay within those parameters. I'm happy to allow some room of discretion that is connected to that, but the further we go away from that, the more difficult it would be for me as chair to allow that. But please proceed.
Well,
Sorry.
thank you very much, Mr. Chair, but I would respectfully say that this does fall under a humanitarian crisis. We're talking about political prisoners, and it would be appreciated if the witness could answer the question.
Please proceed.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you, Chair. The issue of human rights has traditionally been manipulated against Cuba. In Cuba, no one is in prison for their beliefs, but for breaking the law. No one is in jail without having been tried following due process. Many of the so-called political prisoners have confessed to being paid agents in the service of a superpower that seeks to destroy the Cuban order. The revolution has a long history of human rights achievements, fundamental rights like universal education, free public health care, the end of discrimination based on race, sex, or sexual orientation. Cuba is also founding member of the United Nations Human Rights Council and cooperates with the periodic reviews in conduct of the human rights situation in our country. And I have to say that the true and massive threat to human rights in Cuba is the economic blockade by the U.S. Nowadays, we have a lot of problems in the hospitals, children that have no possibilities to receive the proper treatment to cancer or hemodialysis or things like that, simply because they are trying to asphyxiate our society. So we could talk about human rights for a long time, but I don't think we are perfect, but I don't think either that we should be pointed out on this. Thank you.
Well, Ambassador, it's interesting that you say that about the United States because your government claims to be willing to talk to the United States as equals, and that's a quote from your own government. So I'm wondering, does that same willingness extend to allowing the Cuban people to speak freely, form opposition parties, and vote in free and fair elections, or is dialogue only acceptable when it helps preserve the current monopoly on power?
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président. Cette motion.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. This is there is a humanitarian crisis in Cuba right now, and this is what the motion is all about. And we are supposed to be looking at the different ways on how we can come in aid of the people who are living unprecedented humanitarian crisis. The idea here is that is why we're here. This is why we're all here today. There was a specific motion that was voted on by the committee because otherwise in the next sessions, we're going to be going all over the map and not respecting the spirit of things. And I'm not interested in that.
To the member, I would urge MP Rood to try to come back to the topic that was agreed to by all the members. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Chair, I can think of no greater concern than the oppressive actions the socialist dictatorship imposes on its own people. So I will go back to the question again. Your government claims to be willing to talk to the United States as equals. So if you
The
could answer the
dialogue
question.
between Cuba and the United States is I'm sorry, outside of the scope. I'm happy to allow some room away from the core issue, which is humanitarian condition, but the relationship and the dialogue between, if it exists, between the United States and Cuba, you would agree, MP would not be under the discussion, the topic, which is the humanitarian situation on the ground in Cuba. So I would urge you to probably rephrase the question.
Well, my question, Chair, was not about the United States. It was does the same willingness extend to allowing the Cuban people to speak freely, form opposition parties, and vote in free, fair elections? That was my question.
Okay. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Honorable Lion Root, for the question. It's true that Cuba wants to speak as equals like with the United States and with other countries. Is our right, I believe. We are an independent country. And it's true that in Cuba we have only one political party. The thing is that the electoral system in Cuba, that by the way is quite similar to the Canadian one, parties don't nominate the persons to be candidates. They are nominated by the people. And directly, the political party doesn't take part on this. People in Cuba can speak freely, and they can express themselves freely. And actually, they do so normally in our democracy system. The parliament in Cuba is, the members of the parliament are elected in constituencies, like in Canada. The new parliament in assembly elects the head of government, who is not elected in a general vote by the entire population. The members of parliament serve for a period of 5 years, and the present assembly is the 10th legislature. Every system has its virtues and defects. I do not believe there is a perfect model. They generally reflect the history and tradition of each country and in laws. It is true that I respect your opinion. You can think differently than me on this, but in Cuba, campaigns do not involve expenses from the state budget or private sources. The candidates are elected or not through political propaganda, but based on their merits before the voters. And whoever wants to be a candidate can be it. It only needs the support of... Yes, but
Yes, my time is running out, though, Ambassador, and I do have one final question before the end of my time. Ambassador, Cuba has actively recruited its citizens, including civilians and members of its military and intelligence services, to fight for Russia and its illegal war against Ukraine. Does your government deny these reports? And if not,
so this was asked before as well. I let it slide then. I think that's out of scope. You would agree? Of course, you know, our collective
briefing note as a suggested question for the
exactly. It's in the briefing notes as a suggested question.
No, that could be a suggested question, but the war in Ukraine is not
in the official notes of the committee, and we are talking about humanitarian. So
Sure.
I think, given the day, I think it's a very valid question. My question was, does your government deny these reports? And if not, how do you justify asking for aid while sending Cubans to die for Vladimir Putin's war of aggression? Canadian taxpayers would like to know that.
Very brief question because of the time.
Well, but I tried to answer the question they are making. I'm sorry if I extend myself in the answers, but I'm
That's
simply
fine.
trying to meet with the interests of the honorable. Cuba has a very clear position on the Ukrainian conflict, and we support a peace solution. We are not supporting any of the contenders. We are not giving money to Russia or to Ukraine. We are simply asking for peace, and this is our position in United Nations, in many other fora, we have defended this very clearly. It's true that a few people, nationals of Cuba, has been identified as being involved in they are mercenaries. They are not members of the armed forces of Cuba, and we have denied very clearly that we are not involved whatsoever in any military actions in this war.
Thank you very much. We next go to MP Stephen Guilbeault. You have 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being here with us today. The Cuban healthcare system has been recognized for a long time as one of the best in Central America and in South America. And I'm wondering whether you could share with the committee the current situation in the healthcare system in Cuba at the current time.
Thank you very much for the question. It's a very difficult situation. As I explained, all the aim of these new measures against Cuba by the United States are looking to provoke a kind of humanitarian crisis. And we are having problems not only with the access of medicines or equipments, but even to the oil to move the patients to the hospitals. There are thousands of people that needs to have a dialysis, for instance, because they are suffering for the kidneys. And to do so, you need to have a transport to take them to the hospital. Not to talk about, newborns or diabetic or cancer patients, or it is really a very difficult situation. You are right when you say that Cuba has a very good health system that is access to everybody with no payments, like in Canada, and we are proud of it. But it's been sabotaged by this situation of the U.S. blockade. And the energetic blockade that is now in force since a few weeks ago is creating a very difficult situation in this sense.
Merci, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. When we talk about the embargo on oil, does this embargo also affect other important goods like medicine, for example, for healthcare needs?
Thank you. The embargo, as you call it, is a real blockade. We have been suffering it for 66 years. I put you an example. During the pandemic with the COVID, we had problems with the oxygen. The plant which produces oxygen in Cuba had a problem, and we tried to import oxygen. And we had a lot of problems to do so because of the blockade. Because the blockade is not only affecting American companies, but also companies from all over the world. We tried to import the so-called artificial lungs to treat the patients, and we had to produce them in Cuba. We need to create a prototype to do it so, because there was no possibilities at all to import them. To import the vaccines against COVID, we had to develop our own vaccines. That's what the blockade means. That's what the blockade is trying to do, is no matter what, health or education or food, let's try to affect them as much as we can, and let's try to destroy them.
Merci. Est-ce que vous pouvez...
Thank you. Could you share with us efforts by your governments with international partners to ensure that there's an increase in humanitarian aid for the Cuban population?
Thank you. We have friends all over the world, including in Canada. I appreciate very much the decision or the news that the Canadian government is considering to approve a package of aid for Cuba. But I have to say that in Canada, there are many organizations that are already working on that, trying to help. And that happens all over the world. So we receive help from governments, from international organizations, from enterprises, from NGOs, even individuals want to help. We receive daily at the embassy people who is writing and asking how they can help. So we appreciate that effort very much. We will try to do our best in order to use that aid for the more vulnerable people, and that the assistance we receive is going to be used properly. I have to say that Cuba has a very clean file on this. Traditionally, we have received assistance from Canada for many years, and this is something that is normally monitored by the Canadian part, and we have never had any kind of problem with the distribution or with the use of the
Thank you very much.
humanitarian aid.
Next, we go to MP Duceppe. You have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being with us today. First of all, we'd like to reiterate the Bloc Québécois' solidarity with the Cuban people, and Quebec has maintained a relationship that is profound and historic. Our goal today is fairly simple: to understand real needs with respect to the humanitarian crisis in Cuba, so that humanitarian aid can be provided quickly, effectively, in accordance with the situation. So for the committee, what are the most serious impacts being experienced by the population? Is it the lack of food, the lack of access to drinking water, hospitals, or other impacts? But what are the most serious ones right now?
Well, maybe the most difficult situation is with the oil products, because they affect everything. If you don't have the energy, it's difficult for things to function. But in the contacts I have had with the Canadian government, with the Global Affairs, we have explained them which would be the priorities, and they are in the energy sector and in the food sector. Those are the situations that we believe are more where the help would be most appreciated.
Est-ce que vous pouvez dire au comité...
Can you tell the committee whether there are segments of the population that are more seriously affected by the current humanitarian crisis, for example, children, seniors, or perhaps regions that are more affected, distant regions from the major centers?
It's true that we have been working for long in our security life system, looking for identify which are the vulnerable groups, and of course children, women are among them. We have projects already with the Canadian government that are supporting them. In certain regions of the country, because of the the other situations like the Hurricane Melissa, for instance, last year, we tried to give special attention to those vulnerable groups in those regions of the country, in this case, in the east part of the country.
J'avais entendu dire aussi que
I have also heard that you need oil not only for your heat plants, but you also need fuel for aircraft, which is lacking, and that would allow you to bring in more humanitarian aid if you have the necessary fuel for your aircraft. Is that still true?
Yes, it's very important for us to have the petroleum products in order to function. I put you an example. If a ship comes to Cuba with wheat, for instance, to produce bread, we will have to operate it in the port. We will have to move the wheat to the places where we're going to work with it in order to produce the byproducts. So if we don't have the fuel to do so, it's going to create a situation. We buy, for instance, I'm talking about real situations. We buy wheat in Canada, and we have been having trouble these days to transport the wheat from the port to the warehouses because the lackability of fuel is completely extensive to the functioning of the economy. You mentioned the airplanes, jet fuel. That is a different product, but we had to inform the international airlines. We didn't have the opportunity to service them, refuel them in Cuba because we didn't have the product. We had contracted the product, but it hasn't arrived because when the Trump administration threatened everybody to apply the sanctions if they sell to Cuba oil products, many contracts were undermined and we didn't receive the products on time. So that obliged us to tell that to the airlines. The Canadian Airlines, for instance, decided to stop the flights. So it's a really difficult situation, what is happening.
vous avez dit plutôt que
You said earlier that, in your opinion, Washington was violating international law. Can you elaborate on this for the committee?
It's obvious. I don't see how you can justify not only the blockade, this one that we have suffered for many years, but now these new measures that are openly against third parties, not against Cuba only. It's evident that they are not accomplishing with the international law. I have to say that in his first mandate, President Trump applied 242 new measures to strengthening the blockade against Cuba. With which reason? No reason. They want to destroy the Cuban Revolution, and that is something we are not going to surrender. We are going to continue fighting.
Next, we go to MP Ziad Abul Taif. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Your Excellency, and welcome again to the committee. You mentioned that there is sort of discussions, negotiation going on with the United States over this crisis. Will you be able to brief us on where the negotiation is going? Is it gone directly between Cuba and the U.S., or there's a third parties involved? That briefing, is Canada involved in any of those diplomatic efforts? That I think will be great if you can brief us on.
Thank you, Honorable. I haven't said that there are negotiations happening. What I said, and I ratify, is that Cuba is openly very willing to talk, and not only with the United States, with any country. For doing that, you don't need to agree on everything. We have, for instance, with Canada, political dialogue, very respectful, very useful, and we disagree in certain issues. That doesn't, let's say, close the door to have talks and to have negotiations. What we say is that we are able to negotiate, even with this administration that is being so aggressive against us, but we are not going to negotiate under threats. We are not going to negotiate, surrendering. We are an independent country, and we decide on our own issues. But we can talk about any matter. We are not saying that we cannot talk about this or that. We can talk about everything, but with respect is what we say. I don't have any information about a mediation in this situation between the United States and Cuba. Thank you.
Ambassador, you've seen this in 1962. It's maybe different circumstances, but basically you've dealt with it back then with changes in political landscaping and the challenges that facing Cuba nowadays. And back then, diplomacy was the way to get out of this and make sure the life of people that most affected is ending. The crisis against the people is ending. How do you see the European Union, for example, who is not really going with sanctions against Cuba in this circumstance, and other countries, how are they reacting to this, and were they offering any help to ease this situation?
Thank you, Honorable. I think that you're very right when you say that the situation today is completely different from what was in the last 50 years. I don't know. There are symptoms of kind of disorder, if I can call it like that. The international order is being moved by a superpower. I strongly believe that we have the right from the international law perspective on this. I know certain countries have raised their voices in order to state this. Others are less active, but in private we are receiving a lot of support, because what is happening is really an unacceptable situation. And I understand that many friends of Cuba are trying to be maybe discreet about their positions. They don't want to create more trouble with the U.S. than they already have.
Good. One final question. 84% of the energy, Cuban energy consumption, is dependent on oil. And that's been the case for a long time. We can even probably say since the 60s, the situation is still the same. Is that correct?
A brief response.
Yes, it's not exactly the same. We are developing a renewable energy program in Cuba. We are trying to change the energy matrix to make it more to work more with, for instance, solar energy. Last year, we could create more than 1,000 megawatts of energy, electricity generation with the solar energy, and we plan to do so this year again, because it's true that to depend on the traditional sources is a problem for us because we are not self-sufficient. And we are also working in terms of using other alternative energies, so the biomass or the wind, and try to generate electricity on these.
Thank you.
With these sources.
Thank you very much. We next go to MP Vandelbeld. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ambassador, for being here today. I'd like to pick up a little bit on what you just said about solar energy and about some of the self-sufficiency in terms of where Canadian aid might be best directed. I was actually in Cuba in 1991 with a student group from my university during the beginning of the special period, and I just wonder how what's happening right now compares to the situation at that time, and what lessons have been learned from that. Particularly, we heard earlier from our officials where Canada's working with women in Cuba on increasing yields in agriculture. You just spoke about some of the clean energy and alternative energy. Could you talk to us a little bit about what Canadian long-term, what Canadian aid, how we could assist in that regard?
Thank you, Honorable. You're very well informed. It's true, we have a cooperation with Canada in the energy area. There is an NGO working on this. There is a project in the Holguin province, and they are helping women to be to play an active role in these changes, trying to use more alternative energies and to not to depend so much in the petroleum products. I have to say that there are not only projects of cooperation, but there are also enterprises, Canadian enterprises, interested in work in Cuba in this area of energy. And we are very open to do so. They could not only trade their equipment to be installed in Cuba, but they could also invest in Cuba to create capacities to generate electricity or other sources of energy to be helpful in this situation we have. Thank you.
And of course, right now in the current crisis, it's not just the embargo and the executive order, but because of the impact on flights, the impact on tourism, the impact on some of the economic development that and opening up of the economy that Cuba was working on, is that creates even more of a multiplier effect on the economic impact. Can you tell us a little bit about what the current situation is in Cuba and what perhaps the international community might be able to do, at least to alleviate the worst aspects of it?
Thank you. Yes, I already explained that the objectives of all these strengthening of the blockade against Cuba and trying to stop any source of providing oil to Cuba is clear, is to have a kind of humanitarian crisis. And they have to use that politically in order to create a situation where they expect the population of Cuba to be so desperate that they're going to overcome the government or something like that. I mentioned it's not new. It's something they are trying to do for many years now. But we need then to address all these problems in a different manner. We are applying a contingency plan that tries to give the emphasis and the attention of the most urgent needs of the population. We are giving the priority to for instance, water supply that needs energy. But the resources we have, we need to use them to guarantee the most important things, like water, like health, like food access, education. So we are trying to organize things in a way that we can survive to these attacks, and we are, of course, looking for other solutions.
Thank you. We'll go next to MP Duceppe. You have 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I don't have much time, so I'm going to give you carte blanche. If there's something you weren't able to say, this would be the right time to say it. First of all, if you have a message to send to countries like Canada with respect to the urgency of acting, that's what I'm interested in the most. I'd like to know how urgent it is to act and what message would you like to send to the international community, including countries like Canada.
Thank you very much. I already said that we believe we are acting according to the international law, who are creating this situation is the United States government. I have to say that we expect the international community to support the situation, to the Cuban people, in one word, because we believe that our cause is just. We are not. We only pretend to exist in peace, to construct our society the way we want, and we are not threatening anybody. We are not menacing anybody. We are not acting against anybody. And what we would like to have is support to exist in peace and to work in our own benefit, in the benefit of our people. You know, the history of Cuba has been very difficult, very hard these years because of the blockade. There is a kind of matrix of information that Cuba is in this situation because it's a failed country, but it's not true. If we are failed, why they took so much interest in destroy us? Why 240 measures in the first 10? Why declare us a menace to the U.S. security? Why they want to destroy us? Leave us alone. Let us try to work in peace for construct our future without interference.
Next, we'll go to MP Cronus. You have 5 minutes.
Oh, thank you. Ambassador, you made a comment about the current Canadian government having similar values to the Cuban one, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to elaborate on that. So when you look at the policy debates that we're having in Canada about things like housing and social programs, do you see any philosophical parallels with Cuba's approach vis-a-vis the Liberal government's approach that might help the government as it defines its policy on humanitarian aid?
Thank you. I think that Canada is a country that has similarities with Cuba, not only in the process to elect the parliament, also, for instance, in the approach to the health system, trying to assure that everybody has the access to a good health attention. And I think that Canada, in its foreign policy, very recently, for instance, Prime Minister Carney, in his famous speech in Davos, spoke about what the world is facing today, the changes that are appearing in the international arena. So we as I said, we have a very good dialogue with political dialogue with Canada, and we don't avoid any issue. We discuss everything, and we differ in certain arguments, but we in general have a very good relation. And I believe that we will find our way to continue constructing this respectful relationship that lasts for more than 80 years now. And we will be very willing to exchange with the Canadian authorities on these issues in order to support the Cuban people to face these difficulties.
I'm wondering if the current situation, the current humanitarian situation, especially in light of those similarities, has prompted further consideration for you of economic reforms, including expansion of the private sector to help mitigate against this kind of thing in the future.
Yes, there are many changes in the Cuban economic policy in those years. I have to say that in the last 20 years, we have introduced a lot of reforms in the economic field, many of them to give more possibilities to the private sector to operate in Cuba. We have, maybe in the last 10 years, created thousands of new enterprises that are working not only in the productive sector, but in services, in anything. We are not closing doors to the development of the private sector in Cuba. But I have to say also that it is our own decision. It's something that we consider it was important for the development of our economy. It's not because somebody else comes from abroad and put that as a condition for us to exist. Is what I can elaborate on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And Emma, and just in that context, as you consider this humanitarian crisis and the values that the current government and the Cuban government share, is there anything that you'd like to say in closing to our government in that context?
No, we have, as I said, a very constant exchange with Global Affairs and with the Canadian authorities. We are exchanging with them on all these issues and others too, and we will expect for maintain the cooperation that has characterized this relationship for more than 80 years.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP Fortier. You have 5 minutes.
Merci. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here today and for sharing your thoughts on the current situation. You mentioned earlier that we have been maintaining diplomatic relations for more than 80 years, and I'd like to talk more about this relationship. If we talk about the cooperation that we've had, what do you think, in which areas should we strengthen this level of cooperation, in your view, of course, with this current difficulty that you are living with, but also how do we navigate the current economic and humanitarian challenges? If you have anything to share with us, it would be well received.
Thank you, Honorable. We have been cooperating for many years, as I said, and the strict, let's say, international cooperation for Cuba is one important source of resources, but we, of course, work very actively in other ways. With business, for instance, I think that Canada is a very important economic partner for Cuba in trade, and we have Canadian investments in Cuba for many years, and I believe that we have opportunities to strengthen this relationship in the economic field. If I can mention a single sector, I would say that the energy sector would be very important for us, of course. But I had to mention also tourism, and there are Canadian companies with hotels in Cuba. They are Canadian companies transporting tourists to Cuba. Now we have this situation, but we hope this is something that is going to be over at some point, and we will try to normalize the relations in the touristic sector too. I believe there are the bigger potentialities.
Thank you very much. And I'm changing maybe the laneway at this time, where I want you to talk about the fact that you have been spoken publicly about the impact of U.S. sanctions in Cuba. And could you elaborate on how these measures are affecting the humanitarian situation and what role the international partners have to play in mitigating these effects?
No, the situation is caused by these measures of the Trump administration, especially those that are trying to prevent the oil products to arrive to Cuba, and the objective is to create exactly this situation of humanitarian character. I think that there are countries like Mexico, for instance, that is openly helping Cuba with humanitarian aid, basically food, and they are explaining also that they are not selling oil to Cuba now because they are affected by these threats of the Trump administration. They are saying we are trying to solve the problem with them, to have an understanding, but they say the Cuban people don't deserve this. We need to help them. And they are doing so the way they consider possible in this moment. I think that is a good example of what can be done, and I don't doubt that many other support is going to arrive to Cuba in this way. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your appearance today before this committee and for your testimony. Colleagues, I'll move on to another item before we conclude the meeting. The clerk circulated yesterday a draft budget of $9,000 for the committee study on Cuba. Do members... It's not in camera, to my knowledge. It's public. It's fine. Yeah. So do members approve this budget? It was circulated yesterday by the clerk, yes. Thank you. And then two more items. We have two informal meeting requests, one from the Global Fund and the other one from the United Nations. From the Executive Director of the Global Fund, Mr. Peter Sands will be in Ottawa on March 23rd and 24th. Mr. Sands has expressed an interest in meeting with the committee. We can think about what members feel about meeting the head of the Global Fund for an informal meeting after the regular committee hours. So from 5:30 p.m. to 6:15 p.m. Members can agree now, or at least think about it. Because we have to get back to them. And then the second one is the United Nations Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Tom Fletcher. They will be in town on April 14th, so I'm suggesting that we meet them after our regular committee meeting from 5:30 to 6:15 as well.
14th, Tuesday or Thursday?
Tuesday. So
Tuesday.
Both of them are on
Thank
Tuesday.
you. Okay. C'est bon.
So I'm open to... Yeah, go ahead.
Moi, ça me va pour les deux. Je voulais avoir des nouvelles, Monsieur le greffier, pour me...
I'm happy with both. I wanted news from Mr. Wiseman. Do we have any information back from Mr. Wiseman? It would be really interesting to have it.
For March 12th, the Canadian Embassy in Washington has indicated that he's not available for March 12th. But they're working with us on another date.
Monsieur le Président, il va falloir quand même régler ça assez rapidement.
Mr. Chair, we'll have to resolve this situation quite quickly because that's one of the priorities of our committee. And since he came into office on the 15th of February, I think that it's quite pressing, urgent. If we send him the 2 time slots for the committee, we have 2 slots per week. He'll come back with a date, and that should be pretty quick. And if it isn't quick, then I think we'll move on to discussions with colleagues in another committee. They'll have to testify. I don't think the ambassador would like to start with a compulsory call to come to the committee. That's something that could be maybe put to him and tell him that next time it will be an order to this to come to the meeting.
That March 12th did not work for the ambassador. So we're working very diligently to make sure that happens. But coming back to the 2 informal meetings, I would like, at least for the March 24th potential informal meeting with the Global Fund, for members to at least make a decision on that. Yes? Okay, so I will respond back.
Just let's make sure we have good soup that day.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. And we'll deal with the April 14th meeting later. Is it our second meeting and next meeting on Cuba will be this Thursday? Is it the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting? Thank you. So adjourned.